So I'm joined here with Paul Sung, who's the co-director of Polystyrene, I'm a Cliché. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Okay. And your film is this the UK premiere of the film, or
It's
is it?
actually the world premiere at
Oh,
Glasgow. Yeah.
wonderful. Great. It's a world premiere, so very exciting. So tell me a little bit about the background of how the film got started. I know you're based in Edinburgh, but how did you kind of come across the theme and the film?
Yeah, well, when we first sort of met one another, Celeste and I, and our writer Zoe Howe, I was living in Brighton. This was back in 2016, and I'd met Zoe. We'd done a couple of Q&As together, and I'd said to her, offhand, if you ever have any ideas for music docs, give us a shout. It'd be good to collaborate. And she had three really good ideas. One of which was Polly, because Celeste and Zoe were working on a book about polystyrene. So we met with Celeste in a cafe in London. I think it was December 2016, and I sort of pitched an idea to them about how I maybe saw the film, which was to choose some iconic locations in Polly's life and explore them in the present day, with Celeste. And also, I asked Celeste if she'd be willing to kind of write some letters to her mum to sort of open like a dialogue. And they were interested in that approach, and over time we developed that idea, and rather than letters, the basis of those letters then became Celeste's voiceover in the film. Celeste became much more present in the film as well, in terms of, we see Celeste, she is, a character in the film, that has almost as much prominence as her mum, really. And then from there, we talked about the type of film we wanted to make. I didn't really want to do talking heads again, because I'd done that on my first two films, and I guess inspired by Asif Kapadia and his style of making films, where we hear voices, but we also see archive. We went that way, and it obviously was. I think it paid off, but using archive is expensive, and I guess that's why it's prohibitive a lot of the time in clearing it all for the rights. But ultimately, I think it made the film a lot more immersive. I mean, when you're hearing people talking about being in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, you get a much richer picture of it when you can see footage from that period and just hear the voice. Whereas if you were seeing, people, Vivienne Westwood or Don Letts in a room in the present day, I think it's a bit more difficult as an audience to immerse yourself in the period. So that was kind of how it came together, really.
Yeah, no, that's very fascinating. And I did think of things like Amy and Supersonic certainly come to mind, but also very much personal stories. Like one of my favorite documentaries was My Architect, and the stories we tell. So I do think seeing it through the lens of Celeste is really powerful. And you kind of did give a really good overview on how you came with that on the archive material. It's really a fascinating mixture. How did you approach that, of finding all of that? I know it can be quite complicated, and as you mentioned, very expensive. But what was that process for you?
I mean, initially we had an archive researcher who worked on the film, and we kind of gave her a rough brief, and then latterly Celeste took on that role as well, along with our editor Zana, who we had an idea of what our story was, and then it was just a case of exploring various archives. I mean, the majority of it is from Getty, but we also used Kino. There was another library that we used that was a smaller one, based in Hastings, and yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think the inspiration for the archive was, films by Julian Temple. And I'm thinking of The Filth and the Fury. There's a lot of great archive from the 70s, but we didn't want to tap into that same, 70s punk archive that you always see. We did want it to be a bit more creative. So, as we were making the film, we would all come up with suggestions. I mean, at one point, I think I suggested The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, because it was a film I'd seen a long time ago. And in terms of the film's mood, I mean, there are moments in the story where it's kind of like a fairy tale, and we wanted it to kind of have, that sense of wonder, and I guess that sense of fear that children sometimes have. Because when Celeste was young, and she was living in the temple, the Hare Krishna temple, and she talks about when she escaped and crawled out of the window, the language that she uses is very, fairy tale-esque. And I think in terms of the archive that you see, I mean, it does match up with what you're hearing, but it isn't always directly, what you hear is what you see. It's a lot more creative than that, really.
Absolutely. And it's yeah, it's a fascinating amount of material. Although I did find it interesting when you're kind of doing, you don't do reenactments, but you take, Celeste kind of takes a tour through, you know, parts of her life. Like she goes to New York, and I lived in New York for a bit, and one of the saddest things was CBGB's is, you know, now gone. So I
Yeah.
liked how you artfully kind of, you know, emulated the experience of a place like that. But yeah, really sort of a mixture between those beautiful shots of, you know, Celeste going through kind of her so yeah, how long did it take for you kind of make the whole film, I guess is the question.
It was a long time comparatively compared to other things I've done. I mean, we had the initial concept, I guess, early 2017. We raised some money in a crowdfunding campaign around April 2017. Ultimately, it wasn't enough to finish the film, and then it took a long time to bring the rest of the funding in. And we were very lucky that we had a couple of private investors come in, and Sky commissioned the film, so that brought in some money. And then Screen Scotland and BFI Doc Society. So thanks to all of those people, we were able to finish the film. But it's interesting, you know, what you're saying about CBGB's, and now it's, you know, a fashion emporium. And I think going there and filming it was there was an irony to that, in that, you know, Polly, as you know, wrote a lot about consumerism and the consumerist society and what that meant in terms of art and everything else. And it's it's a bitter irony that this, you know, great, you know, venue of punk back in the day is now, you know, a retail outlet, and they've preserved a lot of the features, but I don't know, it's a bit like Madame Tussauds in a way. It's not really real, but we're very grateful that they, you know, allowed us to film there. So I'm not going to say bad things.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I didn't even know that's where it still is like they kind of have a museum to it. I lived in the East Village for a long time, and I just suppose it is really interesting that like at her you kind of make that point when she, you know, she reaches New York. That's a critical moment for her and what she sees. And I guess as someone who's doing the opposite, who's lived now in Edinburgh in the UK, I didn't know polystyrene's, you know, I'm not from that generation, but I also you know, didn't know much about her life until I saw this film. So you talked about the crowdfunding, like is there a huge massive pop, you know, like does she have a bunch of fans from the previous that kind of contributed, or how did you go about the kind of, like you said, sort of securing all the funding through all those various things?
Yeah, I mean, Polly has a really big fan base in terms of X-Ray Specs fans and people that like her and her music and what she stood for as an artist. So when we launched that, which was via Indiegogo back in, I think it was about April 2017, we got a lot of press everywhere, really, and we raised our target. And then lastly, we did a Patreon, which also brought in some money. But I think it helps when you're trying to raise, you know, money through a crowdfunding campaign. You either need to have a really, you know, hot idea that a lot of people are going to, you know, be interested in, that has some kind of universal appeal, maybe, or whatever you're making needs to have an existing audience, and often musicians or artists do have that already. And it's interesting in making the film. I mean, crowdfunding is tricky, it's challenging, but if you do well and, you know, you raise your target, what it does help with is it enables you to identify that you have an audience in place. And we knew that already, but it just reinforced how much love there was out there for polystyrene. You know, because she touched lives. I mean, she wasn't a household name, maybe in the way that, you know, Susie Sue or Chrissy Hind is, but in terms of, you know, how she inspired people, you know, considering she, you know, left behind a comparatively sort of smaller body of work than say some of the other punk artists. She honestly did touch people. People were inspired. I think by her originality, by her honesty, and also just by her integrity. You know, she didn't sell out. You know, she could have made those decisions to have more longevity as a career and make more money. But, you know, I think as an artist, she was someone that had, you know, was more interested in art and what it meant than selling records. And I think that's, you know, commendable, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And it definitely came across in the film. And I was really moved by her story personally. But I also thought it was really interesting that she, you know, she obviously represented this iconoclast at that era. And then she was still battling these, the issues of fame and all of that. And I think it's such a really powerful film that if people who push against that as much as possible are still having to, I mean, there's a vulnerability there in your story. So it's really I mean, were you a big fan before, or is it just that yeah, I mean, how did this personally make you kind of learn more about her story?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I was a big fan. I mean, I was a fan. I knew, obviously, by Bondage Up Yours, I knew the album Germ for Adolescence. But often when I'm approaching a story, for me, wanting to learn more about the subject or the participant and go on a journey really with them is important. So I learned, pretty much most of what I now know about polystyrene through making that film. There was a lot of information out there already, and from one of the first times of speaking to Celeste, a lot of those kind of bits of false information that are on Wikipedia, that are on the internet, such as the fact that I don't know if it still says it on her Wikipedia page, but at one point it was that her dad was a Somali aristocrat, which is absolute rubbish. I think maybe Polly had said that jokingly in an
Yeah.
interview once, and it got picked up on. So I learned a lot more, and I already knew Germ for Adolescence as an album, but I grew to be, so it's still an album even after making the film that I can listen to regularly and listen to it all the way through. Whereas sometimes when you're making a film and you have a bit of distance after doing it, but that hasn't really happened yet. And I think that's just because the songs are so good. The
Yeah.
songwriting is she isn't I wouldn't she's not a punk artist. She's someone that writes just pop tunes really, but that appealed to that punk audience at the time.
Yeah, and I often think, I mean, I'm a documentary filmmaker myself, but you become kind of the world expert on these subjects, and really like take a journey with these, these people that you're so it is quite interesting to see how, how that's changed over time. What without knowing too much about what you've done before, what kind of work are you looking into doing going forward? Do you have things planned in terms of your work?
Yeah, I mean, my work really, the first few things I've done have tended to focus on people who kind of challenge the status quo in some way, and Polly is obviously
Mhm.
one of them. I'm also interested in issues of representation around people or subjects that have been, neglected, marginalised, misrepresented. So the next film I'm going to be making is about a photographer called Tish Murtha, who was a working class woman from the northeast of England, whose career was, on an upward trajectory when she was, in her early 20s, and was kind of sort of then on hold when she had her daughter and never really recovered. And Tish was, as someone who documented, poverty in some of her work, which was something she wanted to escape but never really did. So I am interested in kind of exploring stories that, if they have taken place in the past, there's still a relevance today. And of course, we're seeing even greater levels of inequality than the ones that Tish described in her photographs 40 years ago. So yeah, that's the next one anyway.
Great. Well, I think obviously this film is so resonant today, and it was a real pleasure to watch and a real pleasure to talk to you. So, Polystyrene, I Am a Cliché is world premiering at what day of the Glasgow Film Festival?
It's on Saturday, the 27th of February.
Saturday, 27th of February. So yeah, everybody, please check it out. And Paul, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.